Hi, and welcome to the OT is In, the podcast where we merge the worlds of education and occupational therapy to empower families like yours. I'm Sarah Collins, your host, an occupational therapist and a homeschooling parent. I've experienced occupational therapy by supporting families for over 15 years, but also through seeking out support of my own children, so I'm right here in the trenches with you. Though there is not one way to educate your child, there is a lot to consider when individualizing an education. And the goal of this podcast is to explain some of the why behind what an occupational therapist is thinking so you can apply it to your own family. Especially with my three favorite topics: executive functioning, handwriting, and sensory processing. Each episode will be packed with practical tips, expert interviews, and real-life stories aimed at helping you to create a supportive learning environment for your child. So, grab your headphones and get ready to dive in of the collision of education and occupational therapy. I'm Sarah Collins from Homeschool OT, and I'm thrilled to have you with me on this journey of discovery. If you have ever found yourself second-guessing your choices or wondering if you're missing something essential in your homeschool, this episode is for you. Today, we're taking a clear look at what it really means to trust your instincts as a homeschool parent, while also navigating the pressure to measure up to systems and expectations that don't fit your child or your family. You'll hear directly about how to recognize when outside pressures are pulling you off course, how to distinguish between real needs and the fear of falling behind, and why embracing a flexible, child-centered approach leads to more meaningful learning and stronger relationships. This is not about finding the perfect method or escaping all doubts. It's about understanding that your context, your family, and your child's unique development are the true foundation of successful homeschool, no matter what anyone else says or what the trap of comparison tries to tell you. We're going to unpack the common myths and real challenges, sharing practical frameworks for navigating outside opinions, and reframe this idea of gaps or regrets so that you can move forward with clarity and confidence. And before we get started, I personally want to thank our title sponsor, Love Every. You will hear more about them in the middle of this episode. Now, let's dive into this conversation. One of the things I hear most often from homeschool parents is this quiet worry. My child is trying so hard, so why does learning still feel like such a struggle? I want to share a quick story from a mom in Virginia who found a solution by working with Learning RX, because I think a lot of you will recognize yourselves in it. She had two daughters, both struggling in different ways. When her older daughter had finished a full brain training program, what stood out wasn't just better reading, spelling, and math, though those did improve too, but the emotional shift. Her frustration dropped, she stopped dreading schoolwork, and for the first time, she could work independently for longer stretches without melting down. Then, her younger daughter started training, and within just a short time, this mom saw improvements in reading, attention, and memory. But my favorite part, she shared that her daughter was suddenly reading chapter books on her own with no prompting or nagging. I've heard so many amazing testimonies like this from Learning RX clients because this is what they do. They don't teach content, they strengthen the underlying cognitive skills like attention, working memory, and processing speed that make learning feel easier and more rewarding in the first place. Every client is different, and your child may or may not achieve the same results as this family. But if you're homeschooling a child who's bright but distracted, capable but frustrated, or exhausted by daily learning battles, Learning RX might be worth exploring. Their research-backed programs help the brain get stronger so that learning doesn't feel like such a fight anymore for kids or parents. So head to learningrx.com/homeschoolot to get special discounted pricing on the cognitive skills assessment and sign up to get additional information and free resources from the Learning RX homeschool support team. Hey, and welcome back to the OT is In. I have with me today my good friend Colleen, which I am just so excited to share again with you. She has been on this podcast a number of times, and also I have been on her podcast, the Raising Lifelong Learners also several times. Just as a pair, I feel like that we work really well together, and I'm excited to dive into this topic. What we're going to chat about today is what we, now that we're old ladies and have graduated kids, what we wish that we would have known at the beginning of this journey in homeschooling. Before we go any further, Colleen, can you just explain who you are and what you do and where people can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to be back. It's been a while though since
Oh,
we've been
yes.
on a show together. This is fun. It's fun to go back and forth and have this chat. I'm Colleen Kessler. I am a gifted specialist and have worked with families who are raising and homeschooling neurodivergent kids for decades now. I was a gifted specialist in the classroom where I worked with kids to modify their curriculum, work with their teachers, that kind of stuff for gifted and twice exceptional kids. So then I started working with all manner of special needs through that work. And then when I left teaching, I started writing full time. I write for teachers, I write for parents, I write for children, and started homeschooling, kicking and screaming under duress 16 years ago now. One of the misconceptions that a lot of people have when they first stumble across my stuff is that I left teaching to homeschool my children, and I did not. I left teaching to write full time and then be home to get my kids off the bus at the end of the school day. And just because life has a funny way of throwing things at you that you don't expect or think you want, we ended up homeschooling by pulling my oldest, now 23, out of first grade in February of that year, and then decided to take it kid by kid, year by year. And 16 years later, none of my other 3 children, I have 4 children altogether, none of them have gone to any kind of traditional school. I've graduated 2. Both have very different paths. I have a 16-year-old still at home and just turned 13-year-old still at home. And I work through my podcast and my website in my online community with families who are homeschooling their neurodivergent kids, no matter how that neurodivergence shows itself: gifted, twice exceptional, anxious, autistic, learning challenges. My website and my podcast are Raising Lifelong Learners, and my homeschool community is the Learners Lab. So you can find me anywhere online at Colleen Kessler or Raising Lifelong Learners.
I love it. Now, this is actually interesting because I actually thought that you started homeschooling at the same time that you stopped teaching. So I guess that we're all going to learn some new things today. So tell me what your first process was. Like when you decided, you were like, okay, we're going to do homeschooling, right? What was the first thing that you did?
Yeah. So first, I looked up every private school. I crunched all the numbers. I did all the things to avoid having that happen. So I had been teaching already. I had taught for 15 years, just under 15 years. It was like 15. Yeah, it was 15 and a half because I had a little bit of time in there when I was on maternity leave and I had some health issues. So there were little bits and pieces of that 15 years that I was out of the classroom, and I was writing all of that time. So I always loved to write. I wrote when I was young. I spoke when I was young. When I was a teacher, I spoke at teaching conferences and workshops and in-services. When I left teaching to freelance write, I had gotten my master's, and one of my professors pulled me aside and suggested that I look into publishing some of the projects that I had done for him for my master's. And interestingly, the main one that he started talking about ended up being my 6th book published. It started me down a path learning about writing for the educational field and the educational market and for teachers in classrooms. And I started taking on more assignments and really enjoying it, and feeling like I had been missing out on the time that I had with my kids because they would be gone all day, like I would be gone all day working, and then we would have to cram in dinner and grocery shopping and laundry and all of their homework and stuff. It was just Trevor at the time. And it just became overwhelming. So I decided that I would try freelance writing full time and see if I could make that work. So I left teaching to freelance full-time when I had my 2nd child. So we had some health issues between Trevor and Molly, and I took an extended unpaid maternity leave because the district I worked in at the time allowed us a year's unpaid leave with the guarantee of our job back. So I did that as a trial to freelance writing, and I did really well. It's hustle. Freelance writing is a different kind of hustle. You have to always be looking out for the next assignment as you're working on your current assignment. So there were a lot of long hours where I wrote and typed and edited with a nursing baby in my lap. And
Yeah.
it was a lot of work. And so I was doing that and anticipating sending my kids to school so I could write during the day and then knock off and have cookies waiting for them and then spend all afternoon with them and whatever. And Trevor just struggled. He had been labeled as an extreme thinker by his preschool teacher because he just didn't stop talking or correcting or asking questions or whatever. And she had a heart to heart with me before his kindergarten year. This might not be a good thing for him, but we didn't have a choice at the time. And he went to kindergarten and struggled, but had a great teacher team. They had an open classroom between two rooms and they rotated a lot. So there was a lot of movement. And then we got to first grade and it just wasn't a fit. It was very structured. It was a teacher who probably shouldn't have been teaching elementary school. He just was very rigid in his thinking and he was not very adaptable. And there were behavior plans in place that just really weren't appropriate for what we know about how super young children, and we're talking first grade here, like how their brains work. And so Trevor was a casualty of that. And kicking and screaming under duress, we pulled him out in February of that first grade year. And really for that first year, I didn't know anybody who homeschooled. I did all the searches of the blogs at the time. That was back when there was no social media. There was none. It was Instagram hadn't even been created yet. Instagram would come a couple years later after I started my own blog. But the kind of prevailing insight as to how you connect with people around you was to show up at libraries during the school day and look for other school-age children and introduce yourself to see if maybe they're homeschooling. And so we did that and we found little groups. And that first year, we just really went to a lot of libraries and church events I'd read about, posted on library bulletin boards. And I had my infant and in between freelance gigs. And we just used the leftover workbooks from first grade because those were consumable. So they came home with us. And then I dove into more in-depth researching. I went to a couple conferences and conventions at the time to try to figure out what I wanted to do with him. And we'll talk about this, but like how things change, right? Like what you think you're going to use with your kid. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So how long would you say that you stuck to your initial plan or your consumable workbooks, and we're going to kind of stick to finding friends at the library and whatever, what that initially started with? How long do you feel like that lasted?
It didn't last all that long, primarily because if you remember, I was freelancing. And so now that I'm like replaying the timeline, I had Molly, who was a preschooler at the time. She did not go to a preschool, but she was like 3. And I had just had Logan, my other daughter. So she was now my nursing baby. And I had a babysitter who came 3 days a week for 5 hours to stay there, keep Molly entertained, and bring the nursing baby to me when she needed nursed. So I had 15 hours of work that I could do. This babysitter also had a child in Trevor's class. And so when we pulled him home, she took it a little personally. If the school's not good enough for my kid, if the school's good enough for my kid, why isn't it good enough for yours? And there was a little bit of animosity, including little snide comments. I didn't sign on to babysit for him, a school-age kid. So for a while then, I would have Trevor in my office during those 15 hours a week, working on his workbooks at a desk. And the whole reason we homeschooled was because that setup wasn't working. So I think I stumbled across that term deschooling, and we ended up having to let her go, the babysitter, because she just was too negative about what we were doing and really felt like she was taking it personally. And it wasn't. It was not personal at all. It was literal kid needed something different. And I couldn't afford a private school. So my only option was to pull him out. So it was February when we pulled him out. I think probably by April, end of April, beginning of May, we had abandoned everything. And we were going on field trips, and we were going to the farm park and the museums and the zoo and all of those things. And we did a lot of that for the first, like all of that summer and even the beginning of the following year. And then I started introducing a little bit of curriculum at a time. It was instinctive, but we still do that actually. That's one thing that we have kept to over these 16 years that was instinctual scaffolding to the beginning of our second but first full year is I implemented a math program and
Right.
he did his math workbook every day. And then a few weeks later, we added something else. And then a few weeks later, we added something else. And we still do that to a great degree.
That's actually what we do too. We phase in and then phase out. Like,
yes.
Here we are recording at the beginning of May, and my son is like, okay, we finished my grammar and we just finished spelling today, and we have math next week when our co-ops are done. So it's a phase in and phase out. Now, you said two things there that I really want to jump back in on. The first is your instincts, right? Where you were like, this was an instinct. And I think there's so many times that we as homeschool parents who want to be doing the best for our children, but then we also get some of this outside pressure where then when that's happening, we almost negate our instincts. And talk a little bit more about that. Did you feel that? Or were you really trusting of, no, this is what I'm thinking and we're going to stick to it for a bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it brings me to a comment that I got a lot, especially in the beginning, and still get a little bit. But, oh, of course, you could homeschool. You have a teaching background. And if there's anything I have learned in the last 16 years is that my teaching background has often been more of a hindrance than a help, because the teaching instinct, from the educational standpoint, is always to fall back on the me teaching you and telling you what you have to do and when you have to do it. But also we start everything at the beginning of the year and we end everything at some point.
Yeah. And you have a distinct finish of when this curriculum is done, or when I hit 81% of the curriculum. Someone just told me that the other day, that in public school you have to hit 81%. And I was like, what about the other 18 of it? Does that not matter?
It totally doesn't, because there's review in the beginning of every new program. I could go off on that for days. But yeah, anytime, if I look back really objectively, anytime we struggled as a family, because homeschooling bleeds into your parenting and family,
absolutely.
Or as a homeschoolers, it was when I started falling back on, no, we have to get this done, or, oh my gosh, we're behind here. And every time we flowed better or they retained more was when I did trust those instincts. So no, it was an instinctual thing because of the juggling of the little babies and the trying to figure out what was working for him and for us at the time. And it became something that I kept up with because it felt easier for me to ease in at the beginning of each year. But then retrospectively, when I would take the time to reflect, I'd realize that anytime I dumped a bunch at them, we all fell apart because I couldn't keep up with it and they were rebelling against it. And so, so I would say that a lot of my homeschooling over the years has been based on instincts with a healthy dose of the pedagogy that I know. And I'm a nerd when it comes to child development and brain research and stuff like that, because it's my wheelhouse and it's what I do for a living too. So there is a dose of the research-backed and research-based strategies and understanding of how the brain works and how the brain learns thrown in there with the instincts. But when I do go against my instincts and focus more on what is in or what is done in a classroom setting is when I fall apart. So I try really hard to lean on my instincts more in my homeschooling than I don't, but I'm not always 100% successful with that.
Really love that. So what you're describing there is one of the things that I talk about frequently on this podcast, like where you're thinking really into what does my child need, them as a person? What do they need as far as movement? You mentioned that. Or what do they need as far as their day-to-day activity level or their next level of cognitive skills, right? You're thinking through all of that, but then you're also adding in your specific environment. And I have a nursing baby, I have a preschooler, I have whatever. Like, how's it going to fit within your environment and allow them to follow their interests? You're putting all three together, which makes each year a little bit different. And when you're like, instead, I really need to make sure that I get this curriculum done and this thing done and make sure that I tell them that, you're ignoring all of the context and your kids' interests at that point. And really what your specific kid needs, because you're trying to figure out what everyone needs based on this curriculum that's made for the norms. So I really appreciate the way that you're saying what you've considered, and I hope other families can also look at that and be like, all right, let me take off some of this pressure and recognize there's not one right way to do this, but I need to focus in on all of these things. You also, now I want to go back to my question number 2, and then I have a question 3 because of what you said in question 1. Like there's so much I need to follow up on. Okay, so you mentioned the negative comments coming from your babysitter and the personal, like how she thought it was personal, right? We had that very similar thing. I come from a long line of educators. My grandfather actually dropped out of high school to join World War II and then went back to get his PhD, became a teacher at a university. My grandmother's a teacher. My parents are teachers, just all the way down the line. And I literally got letters in the mail from my extended family when we started homeschooling, just about how this was going to be horrible for all of our families, for everybody. And I can say what we did, but I'd like to know, so how do you address this, especially when it was very blatant?
Yeah. So how I address it now is very different from how I addressed it early on. So I want to talk about both of those because this is a podcast episode, what we would change, what we would do the same, what we would do differently. And I know that there's probably going to be people listening to it who are new and are feeling like maybe I'm going to screw my kids up, which is a valid concern. Your concerns are valid. So remember that if you're listening. But then compared to where I am now, it's not even, the confidence isn't even with my education abilities. It's just as a person. I'm grown and matured. In the beginning, I was very defensive, but I also came at it it was a different time. And I didn't know anybody personally who homeschool. I knew of people. I had read some blogs. I had reached out randomly to strangers who wrote about their own homeschooling life on the internet. I knew of people around us because people that I knew people that homeschooled, but it wasn't nearly as mainstream as it is now. And it wasn't, finding the information wasn't as easy either. It was just really, mommy blogs and homeschool blogs were really just starting to take off. And so it was a different era. You couldn't just open up an app and search a hashtag. And so I was very uncertain about my ability to homeschool, my desire to homeschool, and if I were going to be able to be successful. All of my friends were teachers. My husband is a teacher. So I had a lot of that backlash too. I had one teacher that I had taught with previously who ran into us at Target one day when I was with my kids and basically told me flat out that, so one of the reasons we pulled him is because we had found out that he is profoundly gifted and we had an IQ score to prove it. This was my background, but shoemakers, kids going shoeless, you often miss the signs in your own kids that you're working with in a clinical setting.
Preaching to the choir right here.
Yeah. So because it just becomes so normalized in your brain, you just gloss over it as that's just kids. So I missed a lot of those things. And then by the time we realized them and the psychologist came to me and said, this is what you're dealing with, we realized that the school setting was not going to be a good fit. The particular school that we were in at the time didn't even start gifted services until 3rd grade. And at that time, it was like only an evaluation towards the end of the year. So really services didn't start until 4th grade, no matter how they were or their needs were not being met. And again, I had a preschooler and a nursing baby. I didn't have time to go be advocating and changing the system from within. I was freelance writing full time. I was raising babies. And I had a teacher that I ran into that I had formerly taught with that told me in the aisles of Target that I was doing a disservice to other people's children by not keeping him in the school system and using my background as a gifted specialist to advocate for a change in the gifted program to get him services. And I just sat there like a fish with my mouth wide open. I don't know what to say to you. And I just basically said, sorry. So I was very defensive and very like diminished when anybody would question my decision. And retrospectively, like I've thought of that conversation. We're talking 16, 17 years ago now, and I still remember that. I could picture what she was wearing. I wish that I had said, by the time any advocacy work I do goes into effect, my kid will already have been pushed through the system and have graduated. So
Right.
I couldn't sacrifice my kid to the altar of the education system to affect potential change for future generations. I had to do what was best for my kid in that moment. And that's how I handle it now. Though I do it through a lens of what I have come to understand in 16 years of doing this and having people question me, frankly, is you really have three camps. You have some people who just don't know what they don't know. And they're asking really out of curiosity. Like they really have a curiosity to it because all they know is the system. And then you have another group that are questioning because they are concerned. They know the system. They know the system works to some degree because we're all products of the system. And they are worried about your kids' future because they're worried about your kids. And so it's coming from a genuine place, and they just don't know what they don't know, but they're concerned enough about your kids to learn more. And so they're asking out of curiosity. And then you've got the group that no matter what you do, no matter what you say, they already have their preconceived notion, and they think that you're a terrible parent for doing something that's countercultural, no matter how mainstream it's become. So if it's one of those first two, if it's one of the third, I just ignore them. I just say, this is what's best for our family. And I just leave it at that. And if they want to pursue it, I just say, I don't owe you an explanation. And I stay calm, and I just repeat that. This is what's best for our family. This is what's best for our family. And it usually ticks them off enough that they stop asking. I don't run into that as much anymore. But if it's one of the first two, if they just don't know what they don't know, I will let them know that we've chosen to homeschool because it's best for each of our kids. We do reevaluate all the time. Whatever ends up being best for our kids is what we're going to do. And homeschooling, we have found, really is the best for our kids. And I'm happy to tell them more if they want to know. And that's where I leave that. And then if it's the people who really care about my kids, I say the same type of thing. I say to those curious, I don't know what I don't know people. And then I end it with, I promise you, I love my kid just as much, if not more, than you do. And I'm not going to let them fail. And I'm going to do everything I can to help them become the best versions of themselves and be eligible for or able to do anything in the future they want to do. I work in a backward approach at knowing what they want to do and make sure that they're prepped for it when they graduate my homeschool. If you ever want to come over and hang out with us during the homeschool day, come. So that's how I do it now and have for the last 5 or 6 or 10 years. In the beginning, I said less. I was insecure. So I would just say as much as as often as I remembered to, this is what's best for our family right now. Yeah. And then I would leave it at that. So it has evolved.
My husband often says, are you asking questions or are you questioning me?
Yeah.
And that's a very big distinction and a big difference. I think there's a lot of people who are genuinely curious about what it looks like and what a day would look like, and because that's so unfamiliar, and I totally get that. There's also people who have heard horror stories, and those stories are valid. It is a person's story, but that doesn't mean it's every person's story, right? So that is a really important distinction to be made too. And I've said that before. Yeah, that person's story I've heard that. That really didn't seem like a great situation. That's not this one. But I also do think that it is important, I don't say necessarily to take in other people's concerns, but there is a little bit of okay, let me double check myself sometimes because I don't know it all. And there could be something where somebody else is like, hey, have you heard about this option or whatever? For example, that's why my middle son now goes to the Philadelphia Hockey Academy. Not because someone was really questioning our homeschool, but they were talking about how much movement and what that model actually looked like. And I was like, yeah, that actually does fit him perfectly. So that's where we ended up. And that didn't come, I don't think, from a person wanting to tell me like, no, you're doing this wrong, but more of also, I do care about your child as well. And I know you know what's best for your child, but you don't know everything either. So have you thought about this? And okay, like that's just us being open and humble. And I think that's a really great distinction, is open and humble versus like prideful and no, I know everything and this is what's best for my family now, and just don't even ask any questions. Okay, but you are right with that third of I've already got my mind made up and I think what you're doing is terrible and yada yada. Great, go on about your business.
Don't even waste your time. If you can sense that's the type of person you're dealing with, it is not prideful to say this is what we're doing and then walk on. But 2/3 of the people really are concerned and really have genuine either curiosity or want to understand or just want what's best for your kids and your family because they love you.
We're going to pause this episode for 1 second so I can personally thank Love Every for being our title sponsor. You know, one thing that I wish that I knew earlier in my homeschool journey was this. Reading does not need to feel high pressure to become a part of daily life. As an occupational therapist, I now understand that readiness develops over time and that children learn best when literacy is woven into connection, play, movement, and everyday experiences. And that's one reason why I really appreciate the Love Every reading skill set and why I wish that we could have had it when my kids were little. The reading skill set introduces foundational literacy skills in developmentally thoughtful ways through hands-on activities, interactive materials, and playful learning experiences. It allows children to engage with reading without turning it into constant performance or pressure. Especially in the early years, literacy can become something children experience with us instead of something done to them. So learn more about the Love Every reading skill set at loveevery.com. Now, back to the show. Welcome back. Now, Pauline, you also mentioned another thing that I wanted to dive back into. So you mentioned that one of the hardships for you was really when you would start to compare yourself to what else was going on with the other kids that you saw, or even if you knew what was happening in the system at that point in time, and then you would go against your instincts because you were worried of your kids falling behind. I think that's a huge fear for a lot of people. So can we talk to that a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would, and even my kids would do this sometimes. So-and-so is doing this, and I don't know how to do that. And there is validity to, keeping up with the people around you or staying on track or working along, especially in the content type areas, working along the skill-based areas. So content is the different topics that it doesn't matter when you learn about them. Let's say life science versus physical science versus whatever. And then skills are like you have to know how to add before you can do order of operations. So when I would start to see or think about what regular kids in 6th grade do, how they write or formulate their writing reports and stuff, and my kid can barely write 2 sentences in a journal, I would start to worry. I would typically buy a workbook or something like that to make it easier for myself, or I'd sign them up for an online program, and that's when we would fall apart because number one, it wasn't being driven by actual needs or an actual like hierarchy or prerequisite to something that they wanted to do, or
You're even talking about following.
Yeah, maybe. And that's the other thing I talked earlier about how I specialize in neurodivergence. And one of the hallmark characteristics of especially gifted and twice exceptional children is asynchrony. They develop at an asynchronous rate. So they may be cognitively ahead in multiple areas and then physically and cognitively behind in others, and then on grade level or age level in others. And when you are raising and homeschooling neurodivergent kids and you forget that, you start to lump their skills all together based on ages, and it doesn't work. And so you may have somebody and I have had at least 2 of my kids who were, quote, behind, end quote, in writing while ahead in math. And if I sat down with my current 13-year-old and asked him to write me a report on even something he really knows, he wouldn't be able to write it, but he's 3 grade levels ahead in math. And so his cognitive focus and hyperfixation to some degree has focused on accelerating in math. And I know, because I know kids, that at some point he's going to hit something that he needs to improve his writing for. And so it will be easier for me to teach him to improve his writing at that time. We don't abandon writing altogether, but we focus more on handwriting and fine motor skills and stamina building than necessarily the structure of a sentence and a paragraph and a whatever, because at the point he's ready to do that or needs to do that for a class he's taking or a program he wants to be a part of, he'll be more open to do that. So if I let his and his cognitive interest and fixation go with the math, I can pull up the other stuff because he's experiencing success consistently in another area. So his brain and his body and his mind and his nervous system is more open to some of those other struggles and finding success in that way. Now, that said, we talked at the very beginning of this podcast about, we'll discuss some of the things that we wish we'd done differently or
Right.
we really that, what we did. And if I look back, there are some areas, especially with my older two, that I wished I had pushed a little bit more
Yeah.
because at the time they felt very like fraught relationally. And I didn't want I always err. This is a personal, it is professional. It's based in my professional knowledge, but it really is a personal conviction that I focus on connection over anything else. And so if something, even if it's an academic that's important, is going to get in the way of the relationship that I have with my children and they have with each other, I will sacrifice the academic because I know I can always go back to that. But if we're damaging hearts and relationships, that's harder to rebuild. But there were times that I maybe leaned too heavily on focusing on the relationship and not bringing back, say, the math struggle or the writing struggle a little bit sooner. And so by the time they got to the point where they're graduating my homeschool, there's a little bit of like retroactive catch up that they needed to do. Now, both kids have been fine and they do really find a way to learn the things that they need to know. Here's a crystal clear example of that. My current college, of two current college students, but one of them was writing a lot of papers this past year. And I just completely didn't even think about teaching any of my children how to cite works
Oh, yeah.
correctly. And so we didn't go through APA and MLA and the differences between and how you cite different types of work, because when we were writing, we were using the resources together, and it had been so long since I was citing works. Even the nonfiction that I write, I create a bibliography at the end. I don't do foot and endnotes and things like that. It's just more informal. And so I didn't think about it. And that particular child needed to do MLA in a lot of different papers this past year. And so I sat down with them for the first couple papers and modeled for them, showed them how to look up MLA citation of a song, MLA citation of a magazine article, and then we work backwards from there. Now, that child's never going to forget MLA citations now. It didn't hurt them in their academic career. It just made them realize this is something I don't know how to do and a gap I have. But everybody has gaps.
That's what I was thinking. It's an easy thing to then overcome. And even if you had taught that early on and as a freshman in high school, cool, you'd be familiar with it, but that doesn't necessarily mean you wouldn't have to review it and go through it later on.
I still had to look it up. But I will say that, and I don't know if you've experienced this with some of your older kids, those older kids will tell me, you messed up. You didn't teach me this. And I can't help them understand that it doesn't really matter if I had taught them that or not. They may still not have gotten it. I couldn't just sit down with my kid and do MLA. I had to pull up those things. And I have a master's degree and wrote a lot of papers in that format. So if there's anything I would look back at, I would almost say, while there were some things that I wish I had kind of put my foot down, no, you have to write this, or no, you have to do your math lesson today. I think retrospectively, I still did the right thing because our relationships are super strong. I will say that is one thing I'm very proud of. Every one of my children and I have really strong relationships. And that is, it's pretty impenetrable. But I think that I wish I had helped them understand more that they don't need to know everything. And it is actually not because you were homeschooled that you don't know something. It's because nobody knows everything and everybody has to learn. So just that distinction, being more clear about that distinction and saying, yeah, you're going to have gaps. You're going to get to college or trade school or wherever you want to go. And you're going to realize, oh, dude, I don't know how to do this. Can someone help me? And not take the shame of not knowing how to do that and just be okay with it, because it doesn't have anything to do with whether you were traditionally schooled or homeschooled or private schooled or whatever. There would have been something you would have come across.
I love that because it's so true. And honestly, because we are lifelong learners, right? That's what you're talking about, raising lifelong learners. And so we need to acknowledge that we're never going to know it all, but knowing how that we specifically learn or how to find that resource is just as important as already knowing it. So that is a big thing that we've focused on here in our homeschool, probably, and you do too, but we have so many different learners, right? And so it's been key to be talking about this isn't the best way to learn math for you, right? So we're going to stop and back up and do something different for a while. And for my son, for example, really struggled with fractions. And we love CTC math, right? Fantastic, because you can go back and forth between how much or grade levels and things like that. But he actually needed to go even farther where he needed to see something more practically rather than fractions can be very abstract. So we actually stopped for a little bit and read Life of Fred because it's in a storybook style and went through, and then it started to really click and went back. And so we talked about how practically he learns better than abstractly. Great. So we had the privilege to spend some time on that, but the underlying why was even more important. And I'm not saying we talk about, I'm a visual learner. No, I'm an auditory learner, because that actually isn't really true. But we've talked about what do you need in the moment right now, and how could that apply in other situations. So that has been a really key component within our homeschool, is that underlying why. One of the other things that you've mentioned as going through was your children pointing out things that they don't know, which I think is hysterical. Is there anything that they have really said besides, you didn't teach me MLA, but things where they're looking now and comparing to other forms of education where they're saying, I missed out on this, or I wish we had done this?
Okay, so that's super interesting as a question, because I think that it really depends. It does for me in my experience on the personalities of the kids.
Okay. Yeah.
Because a couple times I've heard things like subject area type stuff.
Okay.
Most of the time it's been not knowing all of the pop culture kind of references.
Okay. Okay.
And yes, I have had some of that. But I have one who has always been very not just social, but into and excited about perceived milestones.
So interesting. I was going to bring that up because that's the way my daughter is. Yeah.
Yeah. Having a locker and going to dances and bus rides and graduation ceremonies. But then I have another who could care less about a graduation ceremony, never really wanted to, nor wants to go to a dance, and suffers through some of that stuff because everybody around them wants it. But then will say, I'm socially awkward, and it's because I homeschooled. Well, actually, you would have been socially awkward anyway. So I do get some of that from both the ones that have graduated, but I also get some of, how do I say it? Some of the practical stuff. Now, my homeschool was never a homeschool where, we checked off math today, we made cookies. We had math. And yes, some of our learning was integrated into our family experience, but there still was subjects like in there. Even if they didn't feel it was. Like they may tell you we never studied history, but we did. We just watched documentaries and had discussions and read historical fiction books and nonfiction. So no, we didn't do a history program. So there is some of that, but their practical knowledge of cooking and cleaning and laundry. My daughter, who went away to college, helped some people with their laundry. That was not a problem for her. What was a problem for her was like, oh, wow, it actually really happens a lot more than I thought it did, because I would catch up for them. But the knowledge of how to do it and what can be dried and what can't be without being ruined was something that they had. So that was a surprise from some of them, like what some of their peers who did everything traditionally don't know. Right. But then there was also like, I would have been, sometimes they'll say, it depends on the mood you catch them in. I would have done better if I had been at school because I wouldn't have been this way or that way or whatever. But then other times they're like, oh, I wouldn't have wanted to. I think with anything, okay, so I want to say this to anybody listening, whether you are a brand new homeschooler or you've been doing it all along, and whether you have or haven't graduated a kid, no matter what you do with your kids, you will have done something wrong. There
Yeah.
will be regrets. They will have
Hmm.
regrets. You will have regrets. And so you can only make the choice, the best choice you can make, the best decisions possible in the moment with the information and knowledge you have,
Yes.
and to do the best that you can in that. Your kids will come to you no matter how well you did. And they will tell you some of the things you did wrong. They will also point out the things that the parenting choices you're making on their younger siblings and why that's wrong. And not just because it's different, because it may not be. And they will
Right.
say things like, that's why I turned out the way I did. They will always think that they could have done better. And you will always think that you could have done better. But nobody can do it because everything is your first time. You're
Yeah.
always a first time parent to a firstborn, and then a
Yeah.
secondborn, and a thirdborn, and whatever. And you're always a first time parent to a college student studying this versus an entrepreneur doing this and going back to college. And so you can only make the decisions that you can make with the limited amount of information that you have. And your kids will always, just like you can retrospectively look back on your parenting and your
Yeah.
marriage and your relationships with friends and your own upbringing and see all of the different places that could have been changed and improved. They're going to do the same thing. So I would just encourage you strongly to be okay with everything that you've done if you've done it with the heart to raise the kids the best you can, teach them the best that you can, and raise them to be the best versions of themselves. If you're doing that and that's the lens through which you're making all your decisions, then you're doing exactly what you can and should do. And you can't avoid regrets personally
Right.
or from your kids. It's just going to happen.
I actually think there's going to be regrets, but I love that they feel comfortable enough to come and talk to you.
Yes.
And that's like a rupture and a repair, right? Which then,
Yeah.
once it's repaired, then your relationship continues to grow. And so I think the ability that they have to say, hey, I wish would have done this, or say, I am some of the way that I am, I think because of this. What is your insight on that? That is a continuous growth moment for both of you. So I think that's a really positive thing to come out of it. One of the interesting things, so my daughter also really thought about a lot of those rituals, right? And that kind of brings me to the socialization question, which is another one of those that at the beginning of homeschooling, I hated that. How are you going to socialize your children? Because I really thought that what people were trying to say was the only way that kids can make friends is in the public school system, and that's what we know. But as I've progressed and moved along, I do recognize that there is some value, again, to that question. Not meaning if you're coming at it with the assumption of the only way to socialize your children, which that term is silly anyway, but is
Yeah.
within this public school system. But now that I'm looking at it from this end, there are those rituals that can be very important that we need to consider and see if that's something for our children that they care and whether that is something that can be replaced or not, right? We also need to think about the number of hours that kids are together to deeply be known and understood by somebody. And I'm not saying that being in English class, whatever, one day a week or 1 hour every day is going to help you to build a deep relationship. But there is very strong research on how long that you need to be around a person to form deep relationships. I think the number from Dunbar's study is 215 hours or something. And so, how are we providing that for our children? And also thinking about other social skills that really can impact their future. So things like public speaking or things like making a presentation and giving it to whether it's a large group of people or just being wise enough in their knowledge to speak it. Because knowledge that just stays in your brain, it may be the idea that starts the next AI or whatever, but we need to be able to express our knowledge too. So those were all things that we really considered throughout. So not the how do you socialize your children, but what are the social skills that really matter? Where are your children getting their needs met and how?
Yeah, that's such a, it's hard. So like you said, in the very beginning, I was like hackles raised. Of course,
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
socialize my
whatever.
pets. I
Yeah.
don't touch whatever, all
Yeah.
that, whatever. And the truth is, your kids are involved in a bunch of different things. And so our goal was always to keep them involved as much as possible, especially, so I would say in the very beginning, that was harder for me.
Mhm.
But at the very beginning, we lived in a neighborhood with kids. And so they were still seeing all of the neighborhood kids, and it wasn't as big of a deal. And then within a couple of years, we started finding more people that homeschooled and connecting with and joining co ops and groups and things. And so my older kids met people and were seeing people consistently and forming relationships. And then my older daughter got involved in theater. So theater was a big place where she formed those relationships. And when she was in high school, she did theater for an all boys school that brought girls in from outside in different districts and settings, and has lifelong friends from
Yeah.
that 3 years of working with those students.
Yeah, I bet you can hit that
It's,
215 hours pretty quick with it.
yeah,
Theater, right?
for sure with theater. It's been harder, I'll say, with my younger two because of the disruption that the pandemic threw in there. Because for us, we had moved right before the pandemic, but we're going to commute to the old co-op because we'd already started those relationships, and it was like 45 minutes instead of the 10-minute drive. And I figured that was worth it to stick with the same group and continue cultivating those relationships and the community that we had already started building. But that co-op didn't regroup after the pandemic. We had to shut down. The people that ran it had various different challenges and couldn't continue running it. And I couldn't take it over. I had too many things on my plate. And so in any case, that ended up just folding. So we kept connected to a group of people that we saw on a regular basis, but they skewed older. So they skewed up to my older two's age group, and we're still friends with all of those people. Whereas the younger two were just at two different kind of cusps. My youngest doesn't even remember our previous co-op.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, and then the other one, she didn't have a lot of super close friends. She was friends with siblings of my older kids' friends, and that isn't a lasting friendship.
Yeah.
Necessarily. So I'll say that got hard for a while, and it still is a little hard. I actually think in some ways it's both harder and easier when they're teens, because when they're teens, they have their thing. And if you can find their thing, they can get involved with whatever that is, like theater for the one. And the current one I have is doing like some outdoor fellowship programs and things like that, and Girl Scouts and stuff. Where it's been difficult is for my younger one, because he doesn't play sports. He's not very athletic. And at the age of 12 to 13, kids really start to specialize on the things that they've been exposed to in previous years. And because of where the pandemic fell and where our move fell and where some issues with he's got some vision issues, our discovery of those fell, he missed all of the rec opportunities. Like rec basketball, rec baseball, and t-ball, and even some of the recreation acting or whatever. We tried dance for a while, but he was just interested in it as a recreation. He did a hip hop class, and the recreation hip hop, it doesn't happen after 13 because all of the kids go on to the teams, and he didn't want to compete in dance. He just wanted to have fun. So it's been hard. And I think that if you have a kid like him, especially, who is more into solitary activities like coding or gaming, which stereotypical, but he is, or rock climbing, or they're more independent. And I would completely and totally agree that is a concern to have. And my older kids will say that to me all the time. You've got to get him involved in something. Is a little weird when we get together with people because some of those social skills, like he's got a lot of the social skills. And actually, we joined a co-op this year. And one of the things I don't love about the co-op, I love everything about the co-op, except the one thing I don't love is they don't do a lot outside of the 3 hours we meet once a week. And so it's very difficult to connect with those people outside of it. And so I'm hoping that we can start doing more field trips and things like that. That's just a side note. But socialization wise, like socializing wise, he doesn't have a problem in that setting. I get feedback from his teachers that he's a delight, that he's a leader, that he's forming groups and creating games, and he was in a Lego STEAM class and his projects consistently won because he knew how to lead his group to be successful together. But that doesn't translate to outside a structured situation.
Yes.
And so I don't have a great answer for that because of the way our society has been restructured post-pandemic. If you don't have your kids involved in something that is structured, it is difficult, especially if there's neurodivergence of any kind or a goofiness or whatever. This is something that in my community, they talk about all the time, finding a place for their kid to fit. So what I would say is, and this is what I'm working on with my youngest, is as a parent who's choosing to homeschool, it's on you. It is absolutely on you to find or create a situation where they can have the opportunity to make friends or connect. That said, there also is the reality that some kids, especially when you're dealing with neurodivergence, are really just not going to find their people until they are completely engaged 100% of the time in whatever their major is or their passion is
and
or whatever.
One of the fascinating things with the research on social skills is proximity is very important. And we talked about that number, right? And being seen and known in that way, but so is common interest, right?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of times when, like you said, gaming or things like that, where that can help to form relationships, but sometimes it's when you're studying the same thing or when you're at work all the time or when you're relating because of the books that you read or whatever. And so us coming up with those ideas with our kids and asking some questions like, where would you want to meet people? Or what is it that you really like to do? Could we invite someone over for a book club? Or what if we have your friend from co-op that you haven't spent much time with come over and play this game with you or whatever? Give some ideas in that way. But I really appreciate when you're saying, you're right, it is on you.
Yes.
To form those opportunities for our kids.
So I think that's a really important distinction. And I just finished recently a 5-episode podcast on social stuff, specifically on this. So
I'll make sure that we link those.
Yeah, I'll send you those links. But one of the things that I think is important in that distinction that you made is setting up those opportunities. That is on us. We have the onus to give our kids the opportunities that if we choose to homeschool them, even if they're asking us to do that, if they're older and they're asking us to pull them and we do, we're still choosing. We are still the adult. We are still the responsible party. And it is up to us to find things that may or may not interest them, throw spaghetti at the wall to some degree, to give them opportunities and see what sticks. That said, we also have to absolve ourselves of the results. We can't control the outcome. You can't force a friendship. There are some kids who just won't make deep, lasting friendships until they're older. There just are. There are some kids who really crave that relationship. And then, so whichever it is, we need to find ways to help our kids get what they need. The kids who are deeply seeking and craving a friendship, we need to give them opportunities to be in proximity and with people that they could form those relationships with. But then the kids that are okay being solitary, we still need to help push them out of their comfort zone so they don't grow stagnant and stay in their own little world, but then be okay with it if they only give that effort at that situation and then they go back home and they're like, I just need to be alone for a little while. So we don't own the outcome, but we are responsible for the opportunities that we're putting in our kids' path. So I think that's really important because personalities really are different. And when you're dealing with neurodivergence of any kind, you're dealing with kids who have a different perception of the world and need to interact with it. I don't have a ton of friends. I actually really only have one friend from elementary, middle school, and high school that I could pick up where I left off. And we really don't even talk that much anymore. But if we did run across each other or talk, we'd be fine. A lot of acquaintances on Facebook now that there's that connection space. I have some very good friends that are like scattered throughout states that I have met through the shared interest of running an online business podcast, whatever, in the homeschool world. My husband is still friends with people he grew up with on the same street. And they're such deep friends. And I don't have that, and he would never give that up. He still sees a group from college every single month at this pub they used to go to. And I don't have that. My close friends were formed through shared interests, shared pursuits, and a deep connection to an understanding of topics that not everybody is interested in. His were all formed based on proximity and playground rules.
Yeah.
And there's a distinction, and you as a parent don't control that outcome or that distinction, but you are responsible for putting the opportunities in your kid's path.
Love it. Colleen, thank you so much for being here, for sharing. I think we both got to share some of the things that we wish we did, but also some of the things that have gone well. And hopefully even our kids will know as time goes on that we're still having these conversations and we're coming back and reflecting. And that reflection is one of the most important parts. So remind everybody again of where they can find you. And thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for it was interesting. It went down lots of different little rabbit trails that are always fun to explore. So thank you for having me. Yeah, you can find me pretty much anywhere on the internet or social media, either at Raising Lifelong Learners, so just raisinglifelongllearners.com, or at Colleen Kessler on social platforms. So search my name, search my site, and you'll find the podcast and the community and social and everything else.
Beautiful. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
As we close this episode, first, I want to thank Love Every for sponsoring this podcast. And second, I wanted to come back to why these conversations matter so much for real homeschool days. We all know that recognizing our kids' needs, staying flexible with routines, and responding thoughtfully to challenges are at the heart of homeschooling. But if you're like most families, you also know that understanding what needs to be done is only the beginning. The real work comes in applying those ideas to the middle of everyday life. And guys, this is why I've been working quietly behind the scenes building something new. It's called the OT is in Insiders. The OT is in Insiders is going to be a monthly space for homeschool parents who want to go deeper into the topics that we discuss here on the podcast, while also having a place to ask questions and connect with other families navigating similar challenges. It's going to be just like having a cup of coffee with me. Each month, I'm going to teach a really short presentation that expands on that month's topics. And then we're going to take that conversation deeper into practical application for real homeschool days. We're going to move into that open question and answer where parents can bring their actual questions, struggles, and real situations for discussion. My hope is that OT is in Insiders becomes more than just extra content. I want it to be a place where you, the parents, can meet other families, feel less isolated, and receive ongoing support as you work through things like sensory processing, executive functioning, handwriting, learning differences, routines, regulation, and independence and learning. There's so much to go through. We're planning to officially open the OT is in Insiders in August, but I want podcast listeners to be the first to hear about it. If this sounds like something your family would benefit from, you can learn more and join the waitlist at homeschoolot.com/OT-is-insiders/. Thank you so much for being here and for being a part of these conversations. And remember, you are not alone because the OT is always in.